Welcome to Machines and More. Hey, today we're going to be checking out a new SFF case. This one is the newly released Q58 from Lianli. And real quick, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. This will be the first of a few looks at this case, and that way you can stay atop of all the updates here. All right, so Falcon Wings has landed. This 14.5 liter case does come in a few options, and I will be leaving that discussion for the end of the review. But the one I have right here for the review today is the white PCIe 3.0 riser cable version. And I did purchase this case myself. Of course, as always, this review is a product of my independent testing, and I'm not being paid for this review. So let's talk specs and features first. I'll give you some measurements. Let's build in it, and I'll share some build tips and talk about the experience. I'll take a look at the thermal performance, and finally, I will wrap up with an evaluation and a few initial recommendations. So Lianli is no stranger to bona fide SFF sub-20 liter cases. Many of you know the classic NCase M1 is made by them, and the recent fan favorite Meshlicious was born out of a joint venture with Lianli. Q58 is a sandwich style layout, meaning the motherboard and the graphics card are on opposing sides of the case connected via a riser cable. And what this case manages to do well is to strike a good balance between size and still catering to those who might want to run an AIO. And because of that, it doesn't require a top hat or even extra add-ons to allow that functionality. Out of the box, you'll get this case and a box of hardware with dust filters and extra brackets. The case is sandwiched between styrofoam. It's well packed. It is simple but effective, and it's definitely not a heavy package either. The eye-catching feature here is these super forward-thinking panels, and these open up like Falcon's wings, reminiscent of the doors on a DeLorean. McFly? Well, if you don't know what I'm talking about, how about Tesla Model X, right? But toolless panels are now common on a lot of SFF cases, but hinged ones that open up like a casement window, now that is pretty innovative, and I think it looks kind of cool. Now each side is divided into two halves, so you get 4 quarter panels for the case. So you get 2 glass quarter panels and 2 mesh quarter panels, and you'll need a pair to cover each side. Now you can use those mesh panels on any quarter, but there is a limitation for the glass ones, and I'll show you why. Because there is a side bracket right here that connects to the case with a thumb screw, and that's meant to prevent it from slamming down onto your table or your desk. And you can use it on the top half with enough tension on the thumb screw, can kind of hold it up outwards like this, but because of the side bracket, you can only install the glass panels on the same side, or both of them on the top half or both of them on the bottom half, but you can't install them diagonal from one another because you don't have 2 of the same type of panel, which more on this later, but I kind of really wanted to install them that way. The case features a magnetic catch, and these panels will just click into place, which is really nice. Removing the panels is also pretty easy. Once you open up the panels, you can just slide them off. The mesh ones are aluminum. The white case is a painted one, while the black is an anodized case, and both versions have a steel interior frame. And let's just review the dimensions here real quick. That does come in at 342 millimeters long by 250 tall and 170 millimeters wide, which gets us to 14.5 liters of volume if you don't count the feet and the back protrusions. Of course, the back protrusions on the card hanger and the top and side panel thumb screws had a little bit of extra length at the back, which is not factored into that volume. Now, if you're thinking horizontal Meshlicious, yeah, it's kind of close, but it's not exactly the same. It's a slightly different layout, but you know, that thought definitely crossed my mind there. Compatibility-wise, it can take a graphics card that requires up to 3 physical cutouts, 61 millimeters in thickness and 320 millimeters in length. For the width of the card, usually this GPU dimension is less of an issue, but the manual does state 150 millimeters as the limit. I do think that's a bit contingent on the shape of the cooler, though, since with the 111 millimeter XC3 EVGA 3080 I tested, the end of the power cable was only about 32 millimeters away, so if your cooler is a more square one, that could potentially limit you to something more like 140 or 143. Otherwise, that limit is really going to depend then on your GPU's power cabling. Of course, to keep things in perspective, though, even a GPU with a large cooler like, say, the Aorus Master 38 is still only 140 millimeters wide, so you're only likely to run into issues if you have a massive GPU water block and you have huge fittings. One thing I'll notice is that because of how close the divider panel is to the back plate of the GPU, serious flow-through cards like the Ampere Founders Edition cards are going to be impeded. Now, it's really not going to be ideal here, and there's no good way to shift this riser cable out. Mini ITX boards only. The fan hub at the back of the case might interfere with the Mini DTX Crosshair Impact 8, and at the same time, running a longer mobile like that is going to limit your cooling options. On top of that, the riser cable won't be long enough, so I'd say you're going to want a Mini ITX board for this case. Power supply wise, you can run SFX, SFXL, or ATX power supply. I always like to recommend running an SFX power supply because that gives you the most amount of space. The one thing to keep in mind is that the size of that power supply here will govern your maximum top radiator capacity, and with an SFX power supply, you can technically run up to a 280mm rad. And the max length there for the radiator is 325mm if you get rid of the front hot swap SSD tray, more on that shortly, or 315 if you keep that tray. Now the Corsair H115i280 unit that I had available to test fit is 320mm or so, and it indeed required the tray to be removed, and even then it still takes a little bit of gymnastics, with the only way to fit it being to place the radiator first, and then the fans on top attached through the top tray. There's a good amount of thickness clearance here with the rad though, and this case gives you about 61mm or so, depending on how much that riser cable bunches up, because that's going to be the absolute highest point above that tray. And but whether you go 240 or 280, this case is going to have that liquid cooling bias just because the clearance on the motherboard side is kind of small. And in that respect, it's pretty similar to the Meshlicious, and the 67mm height does limit one to smaller low-profile coolers, which are more suited for low to moderate TDP CPUs. Obviously, compared to a 280, there's a pretty big divide right there. Unlike with the Meshlicious, the interpretation of 67mm here is quite stringent. There's not going to be much leeway, because in that case, the panels latch in physically, and there's a little bit of tolerance for outward pressure for too tall installations. And if your cooler's footprint does overlap the center line of the case, the extra offset here, which is about like 3mm of the mesh panels, won't help you, because there's this frame on the quarter panel, and that'll prevent the cooler from being able to utilize this extra depth here. Now, ATX power supplies do fit, but it's not optimal. You're going to swap out the normal radiator tray at the top, and this leaves you with, unfortunately, the space only for a single 120mm rad. Underneath this ATX unit, I did measure about 65mm to the bottom of the fan/the SSD tray. So not too much room there. With any power supply, theoretically, you're supposed to be able to place a 120mm radiator and a fan at the bottom. But in practice, it's not really going to happen, just because even the best managed cables at the bottom will still result in some conflict there. And it's just a little bit too tight on space. Plus, your GPU is likely going to overlap that area anyway, unless you have a really short card. A 25mm fan in that spot should be manageable if you manage your cables well. For storage, this case does have a good deal of support for 2.5-inch SSDs, starting with the aforementioned hot swap SSD tray. And this one here is a unique feature of the case. Out of the box, it has a slot right behind the front of the case, complete with SATA power cable and data cable, and you can just slot your SSD right into there. Screws are optional and likely not needed. Gravity does the work here, and it's pretty tight once slotted in anyway. On the fly, you can yank the disk and swap it out for a new one, although I suspect most users would be better off doing it more as a cold swap when the system is off. It's accessible, but you still have to take the top and the front panels off. Lastly, you can sacrifice one of the top fan locations and use that with the included bracket if so desired, and this is the only 3.5-inch HDD mounting point. Now, if you really need that 3.5-inch HDD, there's no other reasonable option, but I'd be a little hesitant on that, just because I think the fans or having that as a rad space is pretty key here. Now, the last features to talk about now are the I/O features, and to that end, this case is great. On the front, you got USB-C 3.1 front header. There's a single USB-A 3.0. Power switch with power LED and HDD LED, and an audio jack, an HD audio jack. On the back, you flip it out, and there's a fan hub here that allows up to 3 PWM fans, and also a 5-volt 3-pin ARGB hub. These will connect back to your motherboard, and this is a really nice touch here, especially if cable management is tight. Eventually, I will be putting my own Ncase M1 build in here, because I want to give this one an extended test. But for now, the initial build will use the same Aorus B550i TX board and the Ryzen 7 3700X kit, just to get some like-for-like thermal benchmarks between this and the Enter 200p Max and some other cases. I just walked things over here, having already set the PCIe slot to Gen 3, since this is a Gen 3 riser. I did find it easy to put the motherboard in first. These are M3 standoffs, and they actually hold the motherboard. They slot into the motherboard hole, so that's really nice. And after routing the cables, I popped the SF600 power supply in, and the space that would house an SSD is fine here for using as cable management also. I did route the 2 GPU power cables through this chamber so they would exit cleanly out the top. Fan facing out is going to be the only reasonable way to mount this, and ideally you want to ventilate for that PSU fan. Now, the PSU shroud doesn't have a cutout or provision for the builder to run the fan the other way, which would have been my preference with this sort of setup, since that would allow the glass to all be on the motherboard side of the case, but I'll show you just how well that works in a second. There are a few Velcro straps on the side of the PSU bracket, and that serves to take up some of the slack in the cables on the side, but even with that, a 25mm fan in the bottom was a bit tight, and I absolutely needed to put a fan grill on the NF-A12x25LS version since I was using it as an exhaust. Even then, I had to use that fan tray to compress against the PSU cables to fit this fan. The GPU is the EVGA 3080XC3 Ultra, and installation with most cards should be pretty straightforward unless it's super long, and just remove the slot covers you need or don't need and put in the riser cable. There's a little bit of flex, but it's not the end of the world. It's mostly supported, even though I think a reinforcement rib at the center of the riser cable would be nice. Once that's installed and connected up, I felt comfortable installing the AIO at this final stage, since otherwise covering the top would take away a lot of the visibility as well as the maneuverability in the build process if done too early. For this build, I'm going to be using the Cooler Master ML240 Illusion, and while you can absolutely go with a 280 in this case, there's a lot of limitations that we discussed, and I think a 240 is just more reasonable with less concessions, but we'll soup it up a little bit to make it competent against the 280. I've been really impressed with the noise level of this Cooler Master pump, but even though the stock Halo fans look pretty nice, they aren't really radiator fans, so I am swapping those out right away to the 30mm Phanteks T30s, which despite their added thickness, they totally fit within the spec here, and they will be running as an exhaust right now. What's cool about this case is you don't need a medium or a large top hat or any top hat to house that liquid cooler. Overall, it's not a difficult case to build in, and one thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of stock I/O cables to manage, but they all tuck away fairly nicely. And I really liked that the power switch cable was this single plug ensemble, because there's no other way to physically plug it onto your motherboard, so it's hard to get it wrong. There's not a lot of places to hide those cables otherwise, but the PSU shroud is an ideal location provided you're not using an SSD mount there. To start the initial discussion on thermals, I've seen a few questions on the panel placement and air cooler selection, and that more in-depth exploration will be more relevant for a follow-up video, but for today I'll limit it to an AIO liquid cooler since I think that's what most of you would be interested in. For the panels, the fact that you can't run the glass panels diagonal to each other takes away some of the guesswork, so I just ran one of the mesh panels directly over the GPU and then the other mesh panel in front of the PSU, and that means the top half of the case is going to be all solid here. A not so good second option would be to run those solid panels completely on the motherboard side and then ventilate the GPU side completely. Of course, that would choke off the PSU, and I did try that just to demonstrate how bad that is. Let's just say I'll show you what happens during the acoustics discussion. I would have preferred the vent on the top side of the motherboard, and that way the rad can draw some makeup air closer to the fans, and that would have helped to offset the penalty from exhausting GPU heat, but then that's a diagonal glass panel setup, and it's a no-go with these side panels you're given. So unless you want to run the solid panel over your GPU, glass over the top half is what it is now. For the initial setup, I tested with fans all as exhaust, and that works well with sandwich cases with ventilated side panels. And I also flipped the rad fans to top intake to show you what happens there, and that often works well if you want to prioritize CPU thermals, but let's just take a look at the thermal performance here. Let's start with the CPU only benchmark. It's not apples to apples due to the cooling solutions deployed, but I still did want to throw some other cases in there for a data point. And in fact, a 240 with good fans like A12x25s or T30s can easily outpace a stock 280. As you can see here, unless you flip it to intake, the Q58 does land towards the bottom of the chart here. In fact, since the T30s tend to outperform the NFA 12x25s that the Meshlicious was tested with, I'd say the CPU performance in rad exhaust in this case would lag behind all these other cases. Taking a look at gaming thermals with Red Dead 2 at 1440p, about 95 to 100 FPS here. The 3080 XE3 Ultra is a new card here, and I am going to have to retest the other cases with this card, but at least directly comparing against the Max that it was tested with already, this gives us a quick glimpse into the gaming performance, and performance is comparable to it, I'd say. With the dual exhausting setup, of course, your CPU, because of the radiator as an exhaust, is going to be adversely impacted by the GPU's heat. But if you look at the radiator fans as an intake for gaming, it's really not an ideal setup. We are looking at CPU thermals that are absolutely great, but for no real benefit, at least in this situation here, because the CPU is less than 100% load. Your GPU is really being held back here, and at these kinds of temperatures, your performance is adversely impacted, and at this point my card was only boosting up to 1655 or so megahertz, whereas at the lower temp it was getting closer to 1820 megahertz, and that difference does amount to a large difference, about 10 FPS empirically. Now, in a worst case scenario with CPU and GPU practically fully loaded, running both Blender and Heaven 4.0, the GPU temps are mostly the same, and this here gives us an idea of what this case is capable of handling. And I think between rad as intake or exhaust, that decision is going to come down to how you use your system. For gaming or scenarios where your graphics card will be loaded for an extended period of time, along with some CPU usage, I'd absolutely go radiator as exhaust. And for applications where your CPU or GPU is bursty, like for content creation or video editing, you really could go either way. I don't think the interdependence at that point will be as big of an issue, so if your CPU is more of a priority, then I think top intake is absolutely fine too. Overall, thermal performance with the case isn't terrible, for sure though. It's not the best in SFF, and I will play around with the airflow a little bit to see if things can get a bit better here, but at this point I think the limitations from the PSU cage being a solid unit as well as that divider being solid, not allowing the glass panel placement location to be a little more flexible does hurt the performance in that scenario, and I think running this way the glass practically is funneling the GPU exhaust straight into the radiator. To close out the performance discussion, let's do some acoustics. Let's take a quick listen to the radiator only, with the fans at the tested level, and then with the GPU at the 70% fans, and finally I'll end with an entertaining quick demo as to why you don't want to put the glass panel over your PSU fan, and that's what's going to happen at higher loads when the fan can't draw enough air to cool itself. All of these noise measurements are done and recorded 20 centimeters away from the GPU side of the case. Take a listen. Overall sound levels are okay, there's nothing that sticks out here, but one thing to keep in mind is that with the sandwich style layouts, which side of you that you put the case on will have a profound impact on how much noise you hear just because of the location of the GPU. I'm not going to assign numerical scores just yet, and typically I like to get a full picture of the case along with some extended use of the case before doing so, but let's just go with some initial recommendations. First off, the pros of this case. The I/O is fully featured and the storage options are really decent, and I love that hot swap SSD and the fan and the RGB hub, and it's fully featured there for the Q58. The build quality and the materials of the Q58 are quite good, and I think the form of the case, it's quite attractive as well. Now, while the sandwich style layout isn't necessarily innovative or a new thing, the fact that this one takes up to a 280 in the optimal position at the top without having to resort to add-ons like a top hat, that's a huge plus, notwithstanding the size limitations with a 280 of course. The panels are different and unique, the hinges are really neat, and the magnetic closure is secure. Although I have to say I find it quite odd that half the case is transparent, because I really don't enjoy looking at this top quarter, or really any quarter for that matter. And maybe I want to see the GPU, but I have to cover it with a mesh anyway, right? So this case is so close to being an amazing case rather than just a good case, but I think there are a few cons that hold it back here. Now, first off, once you get over the novelty of the panels, that's when you start to wonder about some of the functional design choices here. And I'm not sure why PC panels need to be hinged. It's not like it's a big heavy panel like your car's hood, especially not these, that you can't easily remove. The other thing is, well, to really work in this case, you're going to have to at least take off the top panels. And it's not like I'm just going to be regularly opening up the panel and grabbing something out of this case like a bag of chips, right? So maybe the hinges are addressing an issue that doesn't exist, and then the center line of the case is also a visual distraction as well. But those considerations aside, I think the bigger issue is the impact of these panels on thermals. There isn't an all-mesh version yet, and I've yet to see individual panels to be available here in the US, but I don't think it has to be all-mesh necessarily. You just need to allow the right section to be ventilated. Now, before doing any mods to this case, I just popped the top motherboard side glass panel open, and I'll rerun the combo test here. Yeah, you can see venting that top MOBO side, potentially this case does catch up quite a bit to the NR200P Max here. And even though neither of these will be top tier for SFF, for a vertical GPU sandwich layout, this I think would be getting into what I would consider pretty good territory. Now, for this to be possible with a stock panel setup, you would need to be able to set up the other glass panel on the bottom side, and that doesn't work with the safety catches, right? Furthermore, the fact that you can't just flip your PSU fan to face in because of your PSU shroud being a solid chunk, that to me is a problem, because that forces the bottom motherboard side panel to be mesh, assuming you're in a scenario where your fan is going to be running. And I do like the concept here, since using the glass panel selectively can actually allow you to choose where you want the makeup air or the exhaust air, right? Depending on your choice of a negative or positive pressure setup, it allows you to choose where that makeup air comes from. And if this is what this case is featured around, that's great. And what I want is complete freedom here. And personally, I don't think the potential for the glass panels hitting your work surface is that big of a deal. If it's such an issue, then put it on a mat, right? But that's something as a user I can take responsibility for. Now, cutting out the PSU shroud and the divider to allow better airflow if the user isn't using an SSD there is going to be a good idea, and I think most users aren't going to need that spot necessarily because of M.2 pricing right now, and then I think you still have that front SSD position, and I think that would allow for a bit better support for flow-through cards. And if a user is running a 2-slot card, well, it would be more optimal for airflow if there's a channel through the center of the case. So the ability to shift a riser cable out a single slot would be pretty helpful, especially for those with FE Ampere cards. And this could have been easily ameliorated with removable standoffs and an extra set of drilled holes, but instead here you have standoffs that are riveted into the case. Now, thermally, it's not ideal for hot GPUs for something like a 3080, and there seems to have been this overemphasis on narrowness here, and even 20 millimeters of additional space here to still preserve compatibility with 3-slot cards, and also to allow for a center channel would really help things out, and that would come at the expense of just 1.5 liters or so of volume. And I appreciate the accommodation for a bottom fan for that, but for that to be really effective, more of an air gap would be needed. Here there's only about 1 centimeter under the case tray, and I think taller legs would be better. I mean, they're not quoting the leg height into the calculation anyway, right? So alternately, a flat bracket would be good if you just want to limit the fan to be a 15mm slim fan. Taking a step back though, I think Lian Li did quite well, and I think this case manages to strike a very careful balance between features, compatibility, size, and performance, and the overwhelming value proposition here isn't that it excels at any single one of those, but rather it's the amalgamation of all of those things. And because of that, it's going to cater to a big swath of users, content creators, power users, gamers, and SFF enthusiasts, or everyone else in between, right? So if what you want is a sub 15-liter case to liquid cool that does most things well with great I/O and a slight bias towards storage, this one here is a really compelling option, and with some tweaks to this design, I think this case can easily excel in the thermal performance department as well. So finally, to put the recommendations and the value into context, let's just talk about the pricing and the options. The black with a 3.0 riser cable is going to be your lowest priced entry point at $130. The white will cost you about $10 US more. It gets you to $140. And the 4.0 riser cables are going to add another $30 to the equation. And unless your final destination is a PCIe 3.0 board or GPU, then personally I recommend getting the 4.0 version. Now, it's not a cheap case, and it's also not priced into the league of the more boutique cases either. And so it's similar to the pricing on the Meshlicious, like for like. So final recommendation I'll give here in this initial review is if you get this case, do be realistic about what you put in it right now. This isn't an NR200 where it can take anything you can throw at it. So a 6 to 8 core CPU paired with something like a 3060 Ti or 3070 level of graphics card, that's definitely going to be more suitable. At the same time, I can also see something like a 3080 and a 5600X or 11400 being perfectly fine also. I just wouldn't go high power on both CPU and GPU, especially if you're going to be seeing heavy simultaneous load. So I will continue to run a few more tests here to see if it can be optimized further, but I already know that I'm going to go and grind these tabs off the glass panels. But with that, let's just check in real quick on your comments here. And I wanted to squeeze in a quick thought about air coolers, and thank you guys for your questions. I think these are really great thoughts. Yeah, your stock Big Shuriken 3 or IS-60 Evo from ID Cooling is going to be the best bet, and that being said, despite these being on the lower powered end of the air cooler spectrum, I actually think it can work quite well here even compared to the 240 because it's not going to see as much interference from the GPU, and something like Matt's 5600X could absolutely work well with the IS-60 Evo when paired with a heavy GPU on the other side. And if you throw these T30s or NFA 12x25s, and we'll be checking out the new Chromax version soon, if you set those fans to exhaust out the top, it could absolutely be a killer configuration. But we'll do air cooling soon, so please subscribe if you haven't already, like, comment down below if there's anything I missed or something you want to see on this case. Build links I'll leave down below, and thanks for watching today.